This video is going to discuss some of the very basics of calculating with significant figures. And I'm going to start with the most common operations that we're going to use math for, and then I'll introduce the rule that's a little less common. And luckily, the rule that we use most commonly with calculating is the one I'm going to show you, having to do with division and multiplication. So let's see it. Here's the multiplication and division rule. It's the most common one we're going to use, and that is that you're going to round to the least number of significant figures present in your numbers. So let's see a couple of simple examples. I also have a video that deals with a lot of the stuff that's on your lab that are slightly more complex, but let's start simple. Okay, here are two calculations. We'll start with simple two-step calculations. This one is a multiplication, that one is a division. And so what we're going to do is, obviously, let's do it the following way. Let's plug it into our calculator first, right? And I'll just write down all the craziness that pops out of my calculator. And then we'll count the number of significant figures, and I'll show you how to treat that number that just popped out of your calculator. Okay, assuming that the little hamsters inside of my calculator are working properly, that's the value that I got. Okay. And so, and by the way, that's what my calculator just popped out. But now let's say that somebody wants you to report that number, right? The results of this calculation here. That's a measured number. That's a measured number. Neither one is exact, right? That would change things. So let's see how we're going to change, or how we're going to alter what we report here. So we've got a certain number of significant figures in that first number. That, in fact, is 4 sig figs. Over here, remembering that leading zeros are not significant, we have 2. So what this means is that when I look through my number here, I'm only allowed to include 2 significant figures, and I kind of work my way from the left to the right, and then I find those first 2 figures that are significant, and I underline the rest. So in an answer key, if you see me underlining something, usually that's my reminder that I'm writing down the answer, but the numbers aren't significant. If I'm asked to report the number, that's the only time that I would do the rounding, right? And what I mean by rounding, I'm sure you've done this in math class, I don't mean to insult your intelligence, right? But any number that is 5 and above is going to cause me, when I report this number, to round that number up. In this particular case, we're not. And so what we're going to report with whatever units are supposed to be on there is this number, right? That is the correct number of significant figures. Because I did a multiplication where there's only 2 in this one, I essentially destroyed the precision in this number, right? Remember, precision costs money, right? So if I didn't want to report this number, if I wanted to report some more digits, I would have had to have used something that was a lot more precise, right? And so that's, like I said in a previous video, those numbers, they actually communicate quite a bit to us. Quiet, Santa. This number, right? Before I write down the answer, let's just figure out how many sig figs. Hopefully you can see it. That's a 3 sig fig number. And that is a 5 sig fig number. So just starting off, we should know how many sig figs are going to be in our answer. It should be 3. So as I said, I was going to write down everything that the calculator spit out at me. Once you start to feel better about these rules, you'll remember, as you're going to see in the more complex calculations with Sig Fig video, which I'm sure you're excited for, what you're going to see is that usually you include all your important significant figures plus 1 additional, and you're going to see that in just a second. So what I would typically do if I had to write down this number to use later, I'd either save it directly into my calculator, or I'd just write it down with a couple extra sig figs, and then we don't have to worry about what's called rounding errors. But anyway, I digress again, right? So we've got a 3 divided by a 5, so it turns out that everything past this decimal point is actually insignificant, which means that we can just go womp, womp, cross it off, and the final value that we would report So let's do, just because this is such an important operation to us as chemists, budding chemists, I'm going to show you kind of an odd situation that comes up when we use big numbers and how to handle that in terms of your rounding. So here we have another multiplication, but an annoying thing is going to happen. That number only has one significant figure, right? This thing has a whole bunch of significant figures, right? In fact, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So we know that when we do this multiplication, we're only allowed to write one significant figure. So watch what happens when I write down the number that my calculator just popped out, and then when I round it. There's the number from my calculator. Keep in mind that I am only allowed to use one significant figure, right? So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to underline that entire series of numbers, and they are actually insignificant, which means that when we report this value, and this will make you really mad if you're a numbers person, is we are only allowed to report the 2, and the rest have to be just placeholders. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So the properly reported value, make sure I got that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yep. So the properly reported number, based on our measurement tools right now, is that, right? That has one significant figure. And a lot of people kind of say, well, what's the point of even doing that? Well, it turns out that you doing like a really, really precise number and then using some sort of like super imprecise one really destroys what precision you're allowed to report, right? So it's often the case that we're going to have to just turn everything else into zeros, and so you'll see that occasionally. Finally, our last rule of significant figures: addition and subtraction. This one's a big pain in the tuchus. Use the number of sig figs of the number with the least number of significant decimals. There are words coming out of my mouth that don't even make sense to me. So let's see some examples. Okay, so here's an example of an addition. And instead of thinking about the gobbledygook that I just threw at you in terms of words, do the following. What you can do is just line everything up by decimal point, right? So I'm going to do 5.053. And then directly underneath that, I'm going to line up everything. So 0.00125. Okay, and what I do is I know the last digit that I'm allowed is the last column that has significant digits, right? And so if we kind of just look at these columns and divide them up like this, I go through and I'll do the addition. I literally just got confused by 5 plus 0. I'm pretty proud of myself. Right? Oops, decimal point. And that rule basically says that the last column with significant figures in it is the one that we have to round to. So it turns out that that thing doesn't have a matcher, right? So we're not allowed to use either one of these numbers. That means to round this thing properly and give a proper calculation, that would be our answer, right? And then of course, if this was greater than 5, we'd round that last number up. And that's it. And it turns out subtraction is exactly the same. You just line everything up and do this exact same rule. As I said, you'll get plenty of practice with this, but I can't listen to myself talk anymore, and I'm guessing you're probably sick of hearing me too. Oh, look. You hear the beeping? Santa, do you hear the beeping? Say goodbye, Santa. Goodbye. Oh, he's got handcuffs on. He can't wave very well.